Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by a writer of a fantastic new rom-com. It was so much fun, and I am so excited to talk about it. So, hello, welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jen. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Susie Dumond. I'm a queer contemporary rom-com writer. I currently live in Washington, D.C., but I grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. And my new book is Looking for a Sign, which is about Gray, who is a queer, almost 29-year-old who is looking for her perfect match. So she decides to go on a date with one person of each astrological sign to try and find who the stars have destined her to meet.
That pitch, when I read it in my preview email, just spoke to me immediately. It is such a great premise, and you do so many interesting things with it, and this book is so many things. So before I get too excited and get too into this, could you just tell us a little bit about your career and your journey to this book? I know you have one book from before this, if that's correct. Could you talk about what led you here?
Absolutely. I might already be diving into the astrology stuff in this question. So I moved to DC because I was got a master's in public policy and LGBTQ studies. So I was working in public policy for some years, working with Congress, but I've always been super passionate about books and a big reader. I started writing for Book Riot, which is a big book blog, on the side when I was working full time in public policy. And it all kind of snowballed from there. I started to realize that, I love advocacy and public policy work, but like books is really like what fills me in a way that kind of public policy work did not. So I wrote a first draft of what became my debut novel, Queerly Beloved. And I, at the time, did not know what Saturn Return was, which is a very important thing for Gray in looking for a sign. But Saturn Return is basically when Saturn returns to the place in your chart where it was when you were born. It takes Saturn 29 years to make a full rotation. And they say in the astrology world that when you're coming up on 29 is kind of a time that like life pushes you towards where you're supposed to be if you're not already on that track. So for me, when I was approaching 29, I wrote my first draft of Queerly Beloved. I put it in a closet and didn't expect to do anything with it. And then I broke my leg and I couldn't touch it to the ground for months. I was super couch bound and sad. It was really rough. And so I was like, well, I have this manuscript and what else am I doing with it? I might as well edit it while I'm just sitting here anyway. So I took some time, I brushed up the novel, and then I participated in a pitch contest on Twitter. And that was, by the time I was pitching it for the first time was a couple of months before my 29th birthday. And everything just kind of fell into place really fast. I met these incredible people who are now my agent and my editor. If I didn't really believe in astrology before, and I'll say I am a Gemini, so I half believe in everything and half don't believe in everything. But I enjoy astrology and I find a lot of tools for kind of like self-investigation in astrology. And so I really think that kind of Saturn return moment is what led me to the writing career that I have, and I'm very grateful to have. So Queerly Beloved was my first, and it came out in 2022.
Nice. Yeah, that is like such a beautiful resonance between you selling that first book and then what you depict in this one. And I did enjoy the point about Geminis because that line is in the book.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about Gray? You've mentioned that she is in her Saturn return, but perhaps a little bit more about her particular circumstances. One thing I just want to say is that like it all starts with a sort of therapeutic like astrology consultation that I hope you talk a little bit about too and how you crafted that, because I would love to do that with like an emotional support baby goat, which is featured in the story. I'm like, this sounds like so healing. So yeah, tell us about a little bit about where Gray is and what sets her on this journey.
Of course. So Gray grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a very conservative Christian family that she always felt, aside from, her parents were not accepting of her queerness, and she basically broke off with her family when she was like 18. And around that same time, when she was finding her queer community, she fell in love with another woman named Mackenzie. They were together for like 10 years before they realized that Gray really wants a family and kids, and Mackenzie really doesn't. So they reached this kind of Saturn return moment where the big life questions were really hitting them in the face. And they broke up, and Gray followed her best friend Cherry to New Orleans. So she's just moved to New Orleans when we're starting the book. And she's been looking for some kind of sign that's going to lead her to her future wife, her future family, all of the kids that she dreams of having, this big family that's just like this vision of her perfect future in her head. And so her friend Cherry is very into astrology, and this one astrologer named Madame Nouvelle Lune. And so Gray decides that she needs to meet this astrologer to really get the advice that she needs to move forward. So our very first scene is Gray's visit to Madame Nouvelle Lune, who lives in this very weird kind of rural farm situation with chickens and baby goats and all of these weird animals and situations. So Gray's kind of in this chaotic environment, but also hearing this very powerful life advice about where she is, where Saturn is. All of these things that have been going wrong in her life are starting to make sense, that they're coming together to push her to something right. So that's how she comes upon this challenge to date one person of each sign, because she's like, maybe there is something to this astrology thing. Maybe I should give it a shot.
Yeah, it is such a, it works in so many ways, because it's sort of like, when I was trying to think of like the psychological motivation, it gives her a project to focus on to sort of like distract her from her own like grief at the relationship that has ended and her upending her whole life. And it's also like a kind of exposure therapy for dating, I spent a lot of time thinking about how, for anybody who is coming out of a 10-year relationship, dating again is going to seem very intimidating and very overwhelming, I imagine. But especially, I guess, contemporarily, when you think of like how much just dating has changed from being, a sort of like spontaneous thing that happened in the wild, let's say, to a thing that happens online. And, like it's an entirely new world. So yeah, talk a little bit about like how, how this project she has given herself feeds into not only like her response to the situation with her ex, but like the sort of like, this kind of coming of age that we kind of do again when we're transitioning from our 20s to our 30s.
Absolutely. I will also come out first as someone who has not dated in the past decade. I met my spouse in college. We were 20, and part of the like inspiration for this book was, if Mary and I were to break up, like what would I do? Like I wouldn't know where to start. When we met, like Grindr was the only dating app. So like, but I'm obsessed with dating apps. I'm obsessed with like how queer dating works today. I constantly pester my friends and I'm like, can I play your dating app games? And just like have their phone and swipe and press the little buttons. And so when I came up with this idea for this book, I literally had to like sit down and interview some of my friends who are deep in the queer dating, train wreck that it is. Dating seems hard in your, late 20s and 30s. So that's part of it, was having to do a lot of research for that, and really like having an interest in what it's like to date after not dating for so long. It was part of what drove this book. I also obviously am into astrology. So I did wonder, what would it be like if you were to go on a date with one person of each sign, and how would somebody come to this idea, and what might it actually play out like? So it made so much sense for me with Gray at this kind of transitional moment, feeling like she's so out of the loop. And even though she is experienced in being in a relationship, that's not the same thing as being experienced in dating. I also, when I go on tour with this book, I've been calling it my astrology apology tour. Because if you've read the book, there are a few signs that don't come out great. And I'm really sorry to those signs. I don't have any problems with any of them. I love them all. I really had to look at it through an Aries eyes, because Gray is an Aries. So what signs just really kind of clash with that Aries energy? And also, not all 12 dates could be great. That's just not the reality of modern dating, that every single first date is awesome. So there definitely are some signs that get the short end of the stick on that. And I'm sorry to those signs. I will do them better in a future book.
Yeah, like the dates are so much fun. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what went into like personifying all the different zodiacs signs for you, because as somebody who is a fan but not super immersed in it, I found it like there was a lot I could recognize there, but also a lot for me to learn. Like it almost functions like a primer for astrology, like through 12 dates. So yeah, could you talk about like crafting each of her dates and how you toe that line between hitting the essential characteristics of each sign without it being like a walking, talking stereotype, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It was tough. So it is hard not to make them a walking, talking stereotype. I definitely sat down. Okay, so I'll back it up. When I started learning astrology for myself, I was trying to learn the basics. I'd read a lot of books about it. I followed a lot of social media accounts. But I feel like what really worked for me was paying attention for one full year to what season the sign, like the sun was in for each sign, which of my friends were having birthdays, who I know of that sign, and what are the kind of common things that pull them together, and also what's so different about them, because like people are not just their sun sign. So what kind of things unified them, and how varied are the Aries in my life, the Tauruses in my life. So that was a really interesting experiment when I first got into astrology, and I already had that a little in the brain when I was working on this book. So I first started off, I think the first thing I did was figure out like what are 12 good first date opportunities in New Orleans, because I really wanted New Orleans and the New Orleans vibe to be a part of the book. New Orleans is a city that I really love and have been to. I've never lived there, but I've been there many times, and it's a place that's really special to me. So I started off with, here's the list of 12 signs and here's 12 date ideas, and which ones make the most sense for which sign. Like which one, if I were a Capricorn inviting someone on a date, like where would I take them? So that, where they went, kind of happened before the character happened. And then when I decided what the date was going to be, then I started thinking about like, how is this sign going, how is this person of this sign like going to fit into this idea? How are they going to work with gray? How are the things about their signs going to clash, and what's going to work well? Like what kind of things are they fueling in each other? So it was a really fun thought experiment. I'm sure that some of them come off a little too stereotypical, but there are certainly ones that we only get to see for a short period of time. So I did try to write it also in a way that people who were very into astrology would know what was going on and appreciate what was going on, but also people who weren't would feel like they learned something and were able to enjoy the story, whether or not they bought into the astrology aspect of it. So it's good to hear that you got some primer from it in helpful ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought up New Orleans too, because it really, in some ways, it serves as like almost a love letter or like a travel guide to New Orleans, like told through dates. Like that seemed like a really fun thought experiment of just in itself, like coming up with all these dates to go on. And I'm really interested in the concept of world building through dates. Something I say a lot in this podcast is that usually we talk about world building with like fantasy or sci-fi, but like we do it when we build real places too. So did you do research into New Orleans, like revisit any of your old trips, or did you spend a lot of time like visiting images and stuff like that? Because it really does bring the city to life in a real way.
Thank you. I, in my writing, am very inspired by place. I think that's something that is really important to me when I'm crafting a story, that I feel like I understand where it is and how that influences the story and the characters in it. My first book, Queerly Beloved, is set in Tulsa, which is where I met my spouse and where I lived for 6 years. And a lot of my family still lives there. I'm very passionate about Tulsa, so it was something that I really wanted there. New Orleans was a little different because I haven't lived there, but it is somewhere that I've spent a lot of time. So I wanted you to get the smells and the sights and the feel, that like kind of humid air. Like I wanted you to feel like you were in New Orleans in this book. And it also, I think something that made it really fun was that Gray is new to the city. So she doesn't know that much about New Orleans either. So she's really asking these people that she's meeting on dating apps, say like, show me your favorite part of New Orleans. And it gives us a chance to see so many different pockets of the city. Yeah, I love New Orleans. And I'm a very food and drink inspired writer, which my first book involves a baker. So there was so much food in that one that I was like, I have to show that I can make a non-food centric romance. And it still revolves very much around food. What can you do? I am who I am.
Queerly Beloved is a great title. I really love that.
Thank
And
you.
something that I did think about is that a little bit of overlap between the two of them is that there is like a little bit of sort of grappling with one's relationship to faith, especially like the faith of one's family, and how that all connects, I think, too, to another theme of like balancing our birth families with our found or our chosen families. So could you talk a little bit about that aspect too, like maybe how that informs the events too, because she is like, while going on these dates, she's also kind of finding her local queer family, which is a really beautiful kind of thing.
Thank you. I love found family in a book. I love found family in real life. My, queer community and family is so important to me in so many ways. And I I think that for the religious aspect of it, like I mentioned, I grew up in Arkansas and Oklahoma, and it's a place that's like rather hard to escape these kind of, even if you yourself are not religious, you have these ideas of what a good life looks like, what it is to be a good person thrust on you by these religious, like the most popular religion in that area, which is like evangelical Christianity in Oklahoma and Arkansas, at least where I grew up in those places. So I think that having to grapple with what expectations are put on you, versus what you decide is a good life for you, is something that's really interesting about the queer experience. Because something that you hear all the time, and something that I think was kind of a part of my coming out to my family, was my parents saying like, it's fine that you're gay. Like, we love you, you're gay, that's fine. We don't have a problem with it. It just like changes our picture of what your life is going to look like. And I think that that's super interesting. So that's something that was really important in Gray's story, that she has this picture of what her perfect life is going to look like. She doesn't know how to get there. She wants to get there. But perhaps it's not just figuring out how to get there that she needs to do, but it's also a little bit of like, take a few steps back and why this picture? Where did you get this picture? And is that really the best picture for you? Maybe your perfect life isn't, what society thinks your perfect life is. And obviously religion plays that a huge part in that for her. Religion has played a part in my life as well. And it was also part of Queerly Beloved, like you said. So it's something that's like, I'm not trying to come in and say like all religion is bad and we should get rid of it. But I am saying like, maybe it's given us some lines to color within that are not serving us.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also a big part of the life phase in which Gray is in too, where you are sort of in so many spheres of life, like shedding the narratives that have been given to you or that you've inherited, and finding out like your own narratives and what you see for yourself. It's so much fun to see Gray go through this journey. And I also really enjoyed the sort of supplemental materials, let's call them, that that you give at the back. It really plays into, I think, the world building that we've just been talking about, and it blows the world out a little bit. It makes it feel really real. So, could you talk about your decision to include those and what crafting those things were like?
Sure. The part of that was the idea of my publisher, who I love, the Dial Press. In their Dial Delights is kind of their subsection for rom-coms and that kind of like commercial fiction. And they like to include the Dial Delights extras in the back. So they came to me and they said, what kind of stuff do you think would be fun? They really let me drive on that one of what I thought would be fun to include there. I did write a couple of recipes for Queerly Beloved, so I wanted to do that again. Like I said, I'm a very food-driven person. So I have a recipe for a king cake that comes up in the book. That one was really fun because I love king cake and I have been making king cake for years, but I've never really like followed the recipe very well. It just kind of turns out different every time I make it. So I did a lot of testing to actually get this recipe closest to what I do when I make a king cake. And I also did a recipe for like a pasta that's in the takes place in the book. It's a lot easier. So writing the recipes were the first thing that came to mind because I'm the food queen. And then also I was thinking about food and drinks and New Orleans, and so I ended up making kind of a food and drink pairing for each sign based on kind of like New Orleans classics. That was another one where I just made a list of like every good drink and every good food I could think of, and then was drawing lines between them, trying to make it all work out. So that was really fun to do. And then I wrote a newsletter from Madame Nouvelle Lune, the astrologer, talking about the life cycle of the zodiac, which is something that's covered in the book and goes into a little deeper. I think that that's a helpful tool for understanding some concepts in astrology and helping you kind of learn the signs in a way. It's something that I kind of grabbed onto early in my astrology journey that helped me start to remember all the different signs and the way they play together. So I thought it might be a fun thing to include.
Yeah, I had actually never heard of that before. And so when it's introduced in the book, I was like, that is fascinating. And it made me think about my own sign differently. I'm a Leo. And so I know I
Ooh.
always thought I was on like the less mature, like end of the spectrum. So it's gratifying.
A little more
Um,
in the middle. Yeah, I love a Leo though. I love a Leo. You do all right as far as characters in the book go too.
that's true. Yeah. And I really enjoyed the Cancer date too. That delightful one. Was there, here's a two-part question. Was there a date that was your favorite to write? And was there a date that was the most challenging to write?
Hmm. My favorite one to write was probably the ghost tour with the Gemini. I'm a Gemini, so obviously I'm partial. Sorry, there's no objectivity when it comes to me writing an astrology book. Like I'm obviously going to have my own sign that I'm rooting for to an extent. And
I
I've
just
been on
realized
a,
I meant to say Gemini date. I said Cancer date, which is actually not a date that I
oh
want
yeah,
I want to
kind of a,
go.
yeah,
I'm
close
sorry.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Gemini date is a ghost crawl of the French Quarter. And I've done that and it is so fun. If you ever go to New Orleans, there are a bunch of companies that do it. Um, they're a fun way to learn about history of New Orleans in a way that also feels like a little spooky and fun. And you get to try like all these different cocktails from all of these really legendary places. So that one was really fun because it covered so much of New Orleans in one scene. Hardest one to write. I mean, the Virgo, for reasons that I don't want to spoil for listeners. Because trying to get that right, trying to make that funny, but also as shocking for Gray as it is at the time. That scene went through some evolutions, definitely. Also, I loved it ultimately, but the Tabasco factory date with the Sagittarius, I have not actually been to their factory. I watched every YouTube video I could find of people touring it because it is a little bit of a drive outside of New Orleans and I wasn't able to go. I will say overall, I wrote a lot of this book in 2021, which was during the pandemic when I did not feel safe to travel to New Orleans. So a lot of it was done with looking back on my old trips, looking back through my old pictures, and a lot of internet research, YouTube videos. I think if you're ever writing a book in a place that you haven't been to yourself, YouTube can be so helpful because people really will get into the nitty-gritty of what it's like to be in a place.
Yeah, it probably helps in a way that like sort of just map type sources don't really help you for that street level view. Yeah, that's really impressive to hear that it was written like during sort of like the pandemic and that you didn't get to travel there because it is so vivid. Yeah, it's just a really fun book and I thought it was a really great time. Are you working on anything next? Like what is on the horizon for you? I know sometimes authors can't talk about what's next, but what are you working on?
My third book is under contract. It has not been announced yet, so I can't tell you too many details about it, but I told you already that I'm very inspired by place, and this one is set in a place that's very near and dear to my heart, which is Eureka Springs, Arkansas. It's this very strange, very artsy, and super queer mountain town in the middle of the Ozarks. And it was built up with all this incredible Victorian architecture that's been really preserved. Like there's not a single stoplight in all of the town because they want it to have this kind of like old world feel about it, but it's also, there's rainbow flags on almost every building. They have drag shows all the time. They have like 3 different prides a year. So it's this really strange town that I love, and it's a place that I went to a lot growing up. And growing up in Arkansas, I didn't necessarily always feel like I belonged there, but I always felt like I belonged in Eureka Springs. So when it was time to write a book set in Arkansas, I knew that's where it had to be. I will also say that one of the protagonists in it is one of the characters in this book, but I won't say who because surprises are fun.
That's a very fun surprise. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing what you could about that. That sounds like a great book too. And if you want to, come back to the show and talk about that one, we'd love to have you back. So,
I would love to. Let's talk next year.
all right, listeners, thank you for tuning in. You're going to check out Looking for a Sign. By the time that you are listening to this, it will be out in the world. So go to your favorite independent bookstore, library, wherever you like to go for those things. All right, thank you so much for joining us. It's time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.